When looking for the king of podcasts, you're at the wrong channel.
Well, excuse me!
Looking for good ideas for life? You're far from good hands.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
If you think the listener is always right, you're far from the right place.
Out of order! Even in the future, nothing works!
Hosted by a Northeasterner by birth, but a rebel by choice.
Are you threatening me?
If you want a host that floats between love and madness,
and we know the night is always gonna be here anyway. Thinking of you's working up my appetite, looking forward to a little afternoon delight.
then play on and listen to Crazy Train Radio.
All right, guys, listen to this blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Within the gaming world, there are your general gamers, but then there are those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming. If you're one of those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming, we certainly got the place to send you. Scorpion Lair Games. That's right, Scorpion Lair Games is the creators of the true crime hit Killers, the card game. Let's not forget they also have Killers Clothing Company, their profiler game, and things like the 5-Minute Murder channel on YouTube. And we certainly can't forget the new book that is certainly a hit, Beyond the Headliners, True Crimes, Myths, and Legends. Make sure you visit Jeff and the Scorpion Lair Games on Facebook and everywhere today.
Hey, this is Keith O'Brien, the New York Times bestselling author of Charlie Hustle. You're listening to Crazy Train Radio.
Also want to give a quick thank you to our friends over at Ultra Pro, who is the leading manufacturer and supplier of sports, comics, and memorabilia storage. Whether it be card cases, sleeves, top loaders, or travel gear, you name it. We are also going to be working with Ultra Pro in the next few months to do some special giveaway packages for the holiday season coming up in a few months, so stay tuned. Make sure you check them out at ultrapro.com. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, childrens of all ages, this next guest has a newer book out talking about one of the most complicated legacies in sports and in life sometimes when it comes to someone's personality as well. Obviously, when I say that, I'm talking about Pete Rose, who we recently just lost. And there was a saying that he would walk through hell in a gasoline suit to play baseball. But the book is called Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose, and the last glory days of baseball. And the guest is author Keith O'Brien. Keith, how the hell are you?
I'm great, Jonathan. Thanks for having me, man.
Right on. And I got to ask, over your shoulder there, is that a fat Elvis statue there?
That is indeed. Good call. Good call. You nailed it. That's my that's my Elvis bust. I got that at Graceland, I think around 2001.
Nice. I won't say I've been in touch with maybe Priscilla, but we'll see where it goes from there. So that's why I stood out right off the top of the head. So obviously, I think this is unique. And obviously, Pete's story's been told and told again in different angles and such. But you got a unique perspective in being from Cincinnati, actually lived for a little bit on the west side. So what was it being a hometown boy, essentially, doing the book?
Well, you're right. I think many sports fans in particular know Pete Rose's story in the broad strokes. I think the reality, however, is that the vast majority of us have forgotten why we ever cared about Pete Rose in the first place, why he was ever someone who mattered. And so, as a Cincinnatian, born and raised, I wanted to go back and tell this full story, the rise and the fall of Pete Rose. I believe he was one of the most ordinary, extraordinary athletes of the 20th century. I think the evidence shows that he very nearly never made it out of the West Side, a working class part of Cincinnati. I think today, in 2024, a kid like Pete Rose wouldn't make it out of the West Side. It just wouldn't have happened. It nearly didn't happen in the 1950s. And so I wanted to go back, tell that story, tell that as a human story, and do it with intimate access to Pete Rose and his closest friends. And, while there have been other books written about Pete, this is the first and only book where Pete Rose spoke to an author when he did not have control over the product itself, and indeed wasn't being paid. And so I got access to Rose. I got access to people in his inner circle, including interviews with 3 different men who placed his bets on baseball. And I was grateful, of course, at the time that I got that access. I'm even more grateful now that he's gone.
Absolutely. And like you said, there's interviews with folks that never really have spoken before. So how did you go about that process of tracking these folks down? Obviously, we have the lovely setup of this thing called the internet and all, but we know that's never 100% accurate as well.
Well, I just did what I do. I'm a longtime journalist, and I want to track down anyone who was in the room, on the field, in the moment. In particular, with this book, I really wanted to delve deep at all of the important turning points, and there are many for Pete Rose. Some that go in his favor, some that certainly do not. And so anytime there was a significant turning point, that was a place where I wanted to linger and do even more reporting. And, I mentioned, that I did those interviews with the men who placed his bets on baseball. Those interviews were crucial. Based on those interviews, I can say definitively that Pete Rose was addicted to gambling. He had a gambling addiction. He could not stop. As one of his closest friends told me, by the mid-1980s, it felt to those in his inner circle that he was a 747 spiraling down out of the sky. There was no way to stop it. Interviews like that were crucial to understanding Pete Rose. I spoke to a woman named Terry Rubio, who for 3 years in the 1970s was his secret girlfriend in Tampa, Florida. And gained insight into Pete during this time through interviews with Terry. And then of course I did dozens of interviews with former teammates, players, people he played with and against on the field to try to paint this three-dimensional portrait of a man who in some ways was very simple, and in other ways was always very complicated, always complex, and really driven to disaster by his own addictions.
With all that being said, and I know this might seem like an obvious question, but hell with it, I'll go with it. Do you think Pete ever lost sight of who Pete Rose was, especially after the banishment and such?
That's a great question, Jonathan. I don't think that he lost sight of who he was, in particular after the banishment. After he was banned in 1989, and by the way, folks may remember, he agrees to that banishment. He signs a document in August 1989, signing his name right next to then Commissioner Bart Giamatti's name, agreeing to his banishment. And then he proceeds for the next 15 years to lie about what actually happened. And in some ways, sadly, Pete Rose continued to lie all the way to the end, not honestly reckoning with the damage he caused himself, the damage he caused others, the damage he caused to the game of baseball. So I think actually after his banishment, he doesn't lose sight of who he is. He fully entrenches himself in a narrative that he wants to tell, and believes that he can in some ways convince us all of the truth of that narrative. If there was a time when Pete Rose lost sight of who he was, I believe it was when he began betting on baseball. Pete said until the end that he did not place a bet on baseball until October 1986 during the National League Championship Series that year between the Astros and the Mets. If that was true, it would have been 2 months after his last at bat as a player. But the evidence suggests otherwise. For this book, I unearthed notes that one of his inner circle friends, Mike Bertolini, kept in a notebook of Pete's wagers in the spring and summer of 1986. And based on Bertolini's notes, Pete Rose is betting on baseball in April 1986. He is still a player manager for the Cincinnati Reds. I think it's fair to say that we may never know exactly when he began placing those bets on baseball. But if there was a time when Pete Rose lost sight of himself, I think it's then. Because by placing those bets on baseball, he crossed that red line. He broke the rule that every player knew, that you could not do that. And if you did, you faced permanent banishment. And when he made those mistakes, he was setting himself up for a failure that he would be wrestling with for the rest of his life.
Well, speaking of that, obviously you're talking about 21D, and obviously the world has changed since 1989, and obviously one of the bigger sponsors I think I had a ghost. That might have been Pete messing with the electric there.
He slimed me.
That's great! Actual physical contact! Can you move?
But no, with sports gambling being one of their bigger sponsors in not only baseball, but in sports across the board, whether it be folks like FanDuel and the other ones, BetMGM and such. So how do you think that kind of thing factors into Pete's story when you tell Pete's story? Because obviously there were times post-banishment that if it benefited certain people, like MLB and such, like the All-Star game in '99, or the Reds when they did the statue or retired his number, where there's possibly money to be made there. Oh, come on back, Pete. They work things out.
Well, let's be clear about a couple things. Obviously the world has changed, as you pointed out, with the sweeping legalization of sports gambling across America. This is now one of the biggest and fastest growing industries in America. Last year in 2023, Americans legally wagered $120 billion, billion with a B, on sports.
$100 billion.
This year, 2024, we're going to shatter that record. We're going to break it. And no one really knows where the ceiling is on that. So the world has fundamentally changed. Baseball, of course, like every other league, has smartly partnered with the legal gambling platforms. It would be economic folly for any sports league to ignore this fast-growing $120 billion industry. And to be clear, any player who would wager on his own games today in the way that Pete Rose did in the 1980s faces the same punishment that Pete faced. So that hasn't changed. But of course, all of these changes were never expected in the 1980s when people put their careers on the line to chase down Pete Rose. And Pete himself was very conscious of the thick ironies that exist between the punishment that he received in 1989 and agreed to, and the world we're living in today. Baseball, remains of the belief that both of things can be true. We as fans can wager on the games, players cannot, and those who do face permanent banishment. But we've just lived through a year where we've had more sports gambling scandals involving athletes than ever before. And that's not going to stop. The evidence is clear on sports gambling. The more that people have access to it, the more likely it is that people will develop addictions. A certain portion of the population, anywhere from 2 to 5 or greater percent, are predisposed to gambling addiction. And the demographic that is especially prone to gambling addiction is young men, in particular, young men with money. And so I do believe in the years to come, we will continue to have gambling scandals involving athletes. And inevitably, when those scandals happen, we will be talking about Pete Rose yet again.
Yeah, obviously there was somebody, I can't think of the name, I believe he was with the Padres recently with the same
Tucupita
punishment.
Marcano was his name.
Then obviously people will talk about this story from last year as well, or in the winter at least, of Ohtani and his translator and such. So, that which was a very big story. But before we go in with Pete, I found it interesting in doing some homework here. And you, like myself, were a history guy, but then led to journalism. So what did you focus on history-wise?
So yeah, I was a history major at Northwestern University many years ago. I was primarily focused on 20th century American history. Actually did a little bit of research in college about the cultural significance of baseball and the historical significance of the Negro Leagues. I did that kind of research in college. And so, I think while baseball has changed, I think we can all agree on that. And it's not nearly the sport that it was in the American consciousness today as it was 50 years ago. I think baseball remains inextricably linked to American culture and to American history, and so it makes for great fodder for stories and nonfiction narratives like this one.
Absolutely. So obviously, as a journalist and outsider looking in, let's just say, what do you think Pete meant to the game on the field between the lines?
Well, one thing that I learned in my research about Pete's importance on the field is this: you can't write the story of baseball in the latter half of the 20th century without Pete Rose. I mean, he is there on the field in some of the biggest moments that baseball will have. He's there off the field in some of the biggest changes that baseball will have, namely free agency, which fundamentally changes the sport in the 1970s. Pete is square in the middle of all of these moments. And, in particular, he's there in the 70s on the field in some of the biggest plays, nights, games that the sport will have. There's the collision at home plate in the 1970 All-Star game where
Ray
Pete
Fosse
Rose runs over Ray Fosse. That is the moment, I believe, when Pete Rose becomes Pete Rose. He's there in the 70s in multiple playoff runs and World Series. He's there on the field in 1973 in the National League Championship Series when he starts the worst brawl in postseason history by picking a fight with Mets shortstop Bud Harrelson. He's, of course, there at the 1975 World Series. I would argue one of the greatest World Series of all time. He's there in 1978 when he goes on a 44-game hit streak, the longest hit streak we have seen since Joe DiMaggio's record hit streak in 1941. And for all these reasons, by the end of the decade, Pete Rose is well more than just a baseball player. He is an American icon. He is crossed over. He transcends sports. For all of those reasons, the Sporting News will name him the player of the decade. That's how big Pete Rose was.
So you mentioned earlier about, in today's standards, Pete might not have gotten out of the west side of Cincinnati just because of the world we live in. Is that just because of how society is, or that he may or may not have wanted to get the best out of whatever talents he had when he came to baseball?
Oh, no. Pete Rose was always interested in getting the most out of his talents. That was, one of his core qualities and one of the reasons why he will ultimately succeed. The reason why I would argue and do argue that Pete Rose was a miracle and likely wouldn't exist today is just because of the industrial complex that youth sports has become. If you're, interested in having your child be a great baseball player, there is a factory of programs that we are supposed to send these children to play in and compete in, and thousands of dollars spent every year, sometimes every summer, on a single sport. For starters, Pete Rose's family wouldn't have had the money for that. They were working class, scraping their way to the middle class on the west side of Cincinnati. Secondly, it's possible that Pete Rose, might not have attracted the prominent youth programs that select kids to play sports. He was small for the entirety of his childhood. He's never the best player on his youth baseball teams. He's never the best player on his high school teams. At a really prominent athletic school on the west side of Cincinnati called Western Hills. In the 1950s, when Pete was there, scouts, Major League scouts, including from the Cincinnati Reds, would come to baseball games at Western Hills. And none of the scouts were interested in Pete Rose. He only gets a break to get a tryout and ultimately get an opportunity to play, thanks to a family connection through his mom's older brother, his Uncle Buddy. Were it not for Uncle Buddy and a relationship he had with the farm director of the Cincinnati Reds, Pete Rose very well might never have gotten that tryout. Even when he does get the tryout, thanks to Uncle Buddy, the opportunity that he's given is in Geneva, New York, for the Geneva Redlegs, in a rung of baseball that's so low that it doesn't even exist anymore. And to put in perspective just how little the Cincinnati Reds believed in Pete Rose, at that time, top players, were receiving contracts of $100,000, $70,000. Pete Rose got a contract of $7,000 to go play in Geneva, and he happily took it. As he said, he would have gone for free. He would have gone for the bus fare. And to Pete Rose's credit, when he got opportunities, especially in the 1960s and 70s, he seemed to make the most of them, and he will with that opportunity in Geneva as well.
So obviously, the Hall of Fame is, and I think people get confused with this. The Hall of Fame is not owned and operated by the Major League Baseball or anything like that, but
That's
they
correct.
do work with them in certain aspects, like board of directors and stuff like that. But I find it ironic that the rule change from the Hall of Fame and the board happened the same year that Pete would have been eligible for it being voted on. So do you think they will ever change that rule and separate from, as far as if you're on the ban list, to be eligible?
Yeah, so let's be clear for those who may not know. When Rose signs that document in August 1989, agreeing to his banishment, he does so fully believing that his name will appear on the ballot at Cooperstown 2 years later in 1991. That would have been 5 years after his last at-bat as a player. There was no rule in place that prevented that. In fact, at the press conference where Bart Giamatti announces to the world on live national television that Pete Rose has been banned for life, Giamatti is asked by a reporter, what are we to do with Pete Rose when his name appears on the ballot 2 years later? And Giamatti says that day on live national TV that he would do nothing to change that and nothing to influence people's votes, and that he looked forward to seeing how the voters, the baseball writers, judged life versus art. It's only 2 years later, as you indicated, that the rule changes at Cooperstown. The board, a committee at Cooperstown, and then a board changes the rules and says that only eligible players can appear on the ballot. It effectively strikes Pete's name from the pool of potential candidates. It's the first time in the history of the Hall of Fame that happens. The writers are furious. Even writers who had no intention of voting for Pete Rose, who again was still lying about what he had done, still not admitting what he had done, wanted the opportunity to vote for him. And 35 years later, as a result of that rule change, we are still wrestling with this great debate about what to do with Pete Rose. Will it ever change? I mean, who knows? People have long speculated that after Rose died, maybe the rule would change. Maybe he would be reinstated. Maybe he would be placed back on the ballot at that time. And that may happen. But the alternative is also, I think, equally possible. Now that he is gone, I do wonder sometimes who will be advocating for him, who will be pushing for Pete Rose to get into the Hall of Fame. I think it's possible that he remains essentially in this purgatory, for forever.
Well, wouldn't that, with what you were just saying there, be the biggest you to Pete? If, and I know why the rule is the rule and all, but now that he's passed, oh, you know what? We'll change the rule now back to what it was prior. Just because he's not getting a job and all that stuff, and the whole expression of what the rule is there for. Do you think that would be the biggest to stick it to him?
Listen, I think Pete Rose burned a lot of bridges while he was alive. Every bridge that was potentially extended to him, he burned it down. And that's part of the tragedy here. If Pete Rose had been honest in 1989, this whole narrative is different. And that's not my opinion. Based on my reporting in my book, if Pete Rose was honest in the first secret meeting, again, secret, we didn't know, the press didn't know, the public didn't know, in February 1989, asking him, have you been betting on baseball? Everything's different. If he is honest 2 months later, in April 1989, when there's a secret deposition in the basement of a Catholic church in Dayton, Ohio, between Pete Rose and special counsel for baseball, John Dowd, I think this narrative is different. If Pete honestly reckons in August 1989, on the day he is banned, about what he has done and how it has ruined him and how he's addicted and how he needs help, the whole story's different. And I don't mean to say that, he would have not been punished. He would have been punished. He broke the rule. Everybody knew this rule. Pete knew this rule.
It's posted in the locker rooms,
Posted right there. It was the best known rule outside the lines in baseball. And yet, Bart Giamatti, the commissioner of baseball at the time, was a man of empathy. And if Bart could have done anything to potentially help Pete Rose, save Pete Rose from himself, get him the help he needed, he would have done that. And I think this whole narrative is different. But none of that happens. And then Pete Rose lies about what he's done for 15 years. And then he, even after he admits it, does so in a somewhat shallow way, in a shallow, self-serving memoir. He believes that doing that has somehow, washed away all his sins, but it hasn't, because what he failed to do, sadly, and he failed to do this all the way till the end of his life, was realize that the lie and the act of betting on baseball, those were bad. But what really damaged him and others and the game was the legacy of that lie. His lie, hurt his loved ones, hurt his friends, hurt the city of Cincinnati, hurt the Cincinnati Reds, hurt Bart Giamatti and his memory. It hurt baseball. And, he couldn't fully reckon with that. But again, that to me is the behavior, of an addict. We all in our lives may not know a gambling addict. But I think a lot of us do know someone who's struggled with addiction, alcoholism, drugs, etc. And, addicts tend not to understand the ramifications of their own behavior.
And the other thing there, too, I think is key. Because you talk about Bart Giamatti, and if he didn't die right after everything went down in that August of '89, the story may have changed a little bit there, too. But final question for you, because obviously I'd be irresponsible not to bring it up. But obviously, I believe it was 2019, 2020, give or take. I could be wrong here. Maybe even 21. I don't have the numbers for the year right in front of me. But the Phillies were going to do something with him for the alumni weekend, but yet there was accusations of with girls, might have been underage, might have not have been. I don't remember the full story, but it was a big deal, obviously, especially in my neck of the woods where I'm at. So do you think that kind of thing would have hurt him as well, even if we're not talking about the gambling side of things?
Oh, listen, it absolutely hurt him. These allegations of Pete's relationship with a teenage girl who may have been underage. So the age of the girl in question was under dispute till the end of Pete's life. Absolutely, damaged his reputation, and is part of the complicated legacy of Pete Rose. In the wake of his death, I have received, emails and notes from all sorts of people. And sometimes I receive emails from people, who share a story that gets to Pete's darker side, his gambling, his relationships with women, his lies. Other times I receive stories and emails from people with stories about something he did to help them, to help others that wasn't even publicized at the time. He was a complicated man, and we will be wrestling with the wreckage that he left us, I think, for many years to come.
Well, the book is Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball, the author who we've been talking to, Keith O'Brien. Thank you so much, sir.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Hey there, Friday fans. We know how much you enjoy the movies. Enjoy grabbing your Friday merchandise and interacting with the Friday family, whether it be at conventions or during our particular watch-alongs. Well, when you're looking to get yourself masks, why not check out our friends over at Camp Blood Customs out of New York State and order your specific custom mask from any of the films. All orders are made specifically. Your needs and wants are. Make sure you find Camp Blood Customs on Facebook, Instagram, and all over social media and order yours today.
Hi, I'm Bill Ripkin, and you're listening to Crazy Train Radio.